Welcome to the Databricks Skill Builder series. We're glad you're here.
We are going to frame this conversation in three different zones, right? What is the core value proposition of UC and why does it really, really matter, right? And you probably have already heard a lot of this if you're coming to me with this, in this Hive to UC discussion, right? But I want to make sure we frame each of these concepts logically and meaningfully. Then we're going to talk about like the UC journey broadly, and then we're going to zoom in specifically, finally, on how we do, from a very technical lens, that UC journey from Hive Metastores. And you're going to see some code examples, right, on how you do each of these steps. And the way that I frame this is that there are some public-facing scripts that can abstract this for you and make it easier, but I want to show you the core of what each component does, right, and why it matters and how you can maybe implement and tweak it for your environment, right? So without further ado, I'm Arthur Dooner, specialist solution architect, both machine learning and data governance. You can't have a good machine learning platform without having good data and good and trusted and safe data, right? So that's where kind of the data governance specialization comes in, right? Really excited to be talking to y'all today. We're going to dive right into a quick review on Unity Catalog, right? So that quick review starts with the slide that you've probably seen from every Databricks person since the beginning of time, but specifically talking about Unity Catalog. And you can kind of see where UC fits in here, right? There's that underlying cloud data lake that layers out like all of the core infrastructure for how your data exists and lives, right? Then there's that there's the additional sort of layer here on Delta, right? Delta underpins all of your lakehouse, right? In an ideal world. Obviously, the real world is a little bit muddier than that, right? There's unstructured data, which we'll cover with like volumes. There's data that is ingested in all these different formats. There's data that comes from different vendors and sources that like Iceberg and Hootie. And that's one of the big things why that Delta Uniform capability was announced at Data and AI Summit to level set and equalize kind of all these different platform toolings to make sure that we have this consistent data lake and there are no more formats, right? Then beyond that, right, there's the warehousing, the engineering, streaming, and data science personas and capabilities of the platform, right? Databricks is an empowered end-to-end solution for data users, right? From machine learning folks to DevOps folks to data engineers to DBAs, right? All of these folks we're trying to empower to build the entire life cycle around their data. And that is an incomplete picture without Unity Catalog, right? With Unity, we have fine-grained governance over the lakehouse. And I'm sure you all have been at one point or another trying to configure S3 or ADLS permissions, right? And you're like, oh, why can't I get any more granular than files? And wow, this file configuration is absolutely miserable and I hate every minute of it, right? It's a slog. There's a lot of config to those object and file store sort of setups, right? This needs to be more systematized and consistent and finer grain than specific layers of just files, right? And that's part of where Unity Catalog comes in. So obviously simplified administration, it decouples that legacy view of access controls and user managements and the Hive Metastore that formerly exist and pushes them all up into the account level instead, right? So the idea is we have a UC Metastore that sits across all of your Databricks workspaces, right, in a region, with the goal that the data becomes more discoverable, more referenceable. There are finer grained data to mine on what is happening in your data estate, such that you get these incredibly powerful system tables and auditing tables, right? And then generating these thoughtful insights on your data and being able to unlock kind of capabilities like lakehouse monitoring, which is a forthcoming capability on literally having like dashboards as to data health and model health on your Databricks platform, right? Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I can make them full screen, but I'm just going to be able to see the Q&A a little bit less frequently, so I will go full screen. So as we keep going, right, that seamless sort of view here is meant to go all the way towards specifically like even lineage, right? And one of the things that you might not be privy to, it's a relatively new capability. We're even extending that lineage capability to Hive workflows. So that is going to make the life cycle of testing that Hive, like, hey, if I'm migrating these data, right, how do I know that I'm not breaking an entire pipeline by moving this data set or decommissioning this Hive pipeline? Well, now there's a clear path towards lineage here, right? What's great about this is that not only does it mine all of this data for you to have these relationships, but it also can be exposed as an API for other enterprise catalogs that might be across a bunch of different systems to integrate with, right? So this ends up being a core capability that speeds up a lot of these governance processes, right? And then obviously, I'm not going to spend too much time on this today, but Delta sharing, Delta Lake, having a table associated with Delta Lake for Delta sharing across, which is an open protocol that other different services can reference and consume from, right? Along with a view towards, right, like, how do we make this easier for everyone inside of Databricks, right? So there are fully managed Delta sharing servers inside of your Databricks workspaces and managed by Unity Catalog, right? That manages a lot of those shares, both to and from, to make that extremely simple. Obviously, end of the day, again, we're just finishing up the level set here. What is this access control layer doing? We have specific permissions down to granular row and column levels, right, on Databricks with Unity Catalog, such that we can say users and groups that are account level defined. Again, not at a workspace level, account level defined, right, on specific catalogs and different, and down to schemas, tables, specific rows, columns, and even like stuff like volumes and forthcoming, right? So this is, if there's a screenshot that you want to take of this, this presentation, I'd say you probably should take this one. There might be one more later, and it will look very similar. But this is the biggest takeaway that I hope you get out of this journey, right? There is a baseline UC design that you do here. And I'll answer that hand raise in a second. That design is then used to do the one-time config and setup, right? That creates the metastores, that sort of thing, right? Creates UC objects like all like the storage credentials and entities to interface with like S3 and ADLS. Being able to migrate that sort of legacy metadata, right? Such that you have that lifecycle, and this is where we're going to zoom in the most on, right? Granting access in the same ways you have your Hive and other workflows existing today, managing workloads as a migration, right? And making sure that each of those workloads work with UC-based clusters and catalogs, right? And then decommissioning anything old. I'm going to answer Ankit's question in text first, and then Jung, I'll make sure to promote you to a presenter so you can ask your question. Can access be granted to AD groups? So what happens, Ankit, I'm going to answer this live, is that AD groups are specifically associated with, and I have a few slides on this in a second, that actually join to the account level permissions, right? And then those groups are kept in sync with a skim sync capability inside of the Databricks account store, which is a control plane kind of abstraction for UC, right? And that is 100% core to how UC works. So as you make new users and groups, right, those continue to stay in sync, right? That becomes super important. Hope that answers your question. We'll dive into that a little bit more in a second. I'll answer Ram's question after I promote Jung to presenter. Allowed to talk. Okay. Jung, what's your question? Okay, maybe Jung doesn't have.
Yeah.
Hey.
Okay, currently we have like an Azure data lake storage, right? And
Yeah.
we have like all of the application, having their own container inside of that Azure storage account. We call it our data lake. So for the UC catalog storage, can we using one of the container from that storage, or should we creating a separate storage account for the UC? Because we have like the reason why I'm asking that is because like we have many applications running and writing to that storage. And I'm afraid that we may reaching the threshold,
like service limit. Yeah.
So that's one of the thing that my concern. And then like if we have like different environment like dev, stage, pre-prod, and production. Should they be in the same storage account container, or should be we creating the container on the same storage account for dev, state, pre-prod, and prod, or should each environment on a separate storage account?
Great questions. Yeah. So there is an abstraction called, and I'm just going to accelerate. We can come back to some of the other questions in a second. I'm going to dive right into like how some of this architecture works, right? So when we set up, hold on, let me hop on over to what a Metastore is, right? Metastore is meant to be a region-based central hub for where all of your managed tables go by default. That does not mean that all of your managed tables, across dev, stage, prod, whatever, have to go to that account, right? The idea is that there is a default landing space, right? And those different tables can be managed in different zones, either managed tables inside of that shared location, an external location, right, where it's maybe associated only with certain workspaces, right, from a networking perspective.
No, I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the external table. I'm talking about the Unity catalog, the schema, for the Unity catalog, the metadata, like the Hive Metastore, for example, right? For those information, but like we will creating like most of the table, the application will be a external table with it pointing the location will be on the application data lake storage account. So
that location can be used as a default place to save certain schemas or catalogs to. Right, that pre-existing ADLS that you have, or you can make a new one, or you can use what's called the fully managed, like the Metastore default landing zone, right? That you basically have options to use what you already have, to save to like a net new space that's isolated and maybe if you're concerned about like ADLS limitations there, you could definitely like start saving stuff to a new and safe space, or you can use that shared managed storage layer. So that works. Any of those options, you can connect to any ADLS endpoint that already exists, or use one specifically for UC.
So when we defining the storage account for the UC,
we'll talk about that in a
yeah, okay.
We'll talk about that in a minute. I'll show you how that life cycle goes. No worries. Yeah. I'm going to hop on over to a couple of the other questions here. And now I am going to go to Rom's question. Will UC work and coexist with external HMS, specifically serverless, even if it means externally ignoring any external Hive Metastore and only wall to UC? Great question. UC works with, so I guess I'd frame this in two dimensions, right? It does not break your existing like Hive Metastore config, whatever that is, right? So if you're using the built-in one in Databricks, right? That's great. It's not going to break that. It's not going to break glue. It's not going to break any external Hive Metastore that you're already using, right? That is associated with your environment. With serverless, there's definitely nuance as to if you have a security pattern that maybe would not allow the cloud management plane to talk to this external Hive Metastore, right? There is some nuance there, but that's less of a UC consideration and more of like a networking architecture question, right? But UC coexists with a lot of external Hive Metastores that folks are using. What I'm seeing folks do is even like they'll centralize around UC, and obviously I have some bias. That's way that like I see folks like evolving into UC because it's just so powerful. And then using the new capability, I believe it's still in preview, of externalizing that UC resource as a Hive Metastore capability, right, for other services to interface with and look like as if it was a Hive Metastore. So there's kind of like the lens that yes, it works with everything that already exists, but it also can be maybe recentered around UC, and then other services can interface with UC that way. Hope that answers your question. Tibib, the Terraform provider allow maintenance of UC related resources. Yes, that's what it does. Any of these resources can be configured either at an account level for like all these top level Metastore things, or at a workspace sort of level for like specific entities through the Terraform provider. You can even do like exports of Terraform configs such that they can be then promoted from one environment to another. That's an awesome way to manage that lifecycle with that resource exporter. Hope that answers your question. Purushottam, we are in AWS Cloud. Does mount work in E2 path while creating a database table? The mount does work in E2 with, so the thing about mounts is like DBFS mounts are legacy nowadays, and those are not governed by UC. They were in many ways like a security vulnerability because there are a set of permissions implicit, right? So you would want to use like an S3A or an ABFS for Azure path when creating any of these databases and tables, such that they can then be these locations can be governed by UC. So I'll show you that how that looks like in the Hive to UC journey. Anonymous, can a catalog have two different locations that can be used for a managed table? I'm gonna answer the next two questions, and then we'll hop into the presentation for a little bit, just to come back to it. Two different locations that can be used for managed table. It only lets us set one. So you can have managed tables in the fully centralized, how do I show this? Unity catalog account level Metastore. You can also have managed tables backed by an external location. So you can have managed tables in any location in your data estate, right? It's just wherever you want to put them that it fits into like your billing lifecycle and management lifecycle. So you can set a default managed location for catalogs and schemas, or even say like, hey, this this specific one goes here, right? Such that you can have these segmented managed tables that are only accessible to certain workspaces, even from a networking perspective. And then lastly, what I'm going to answer right now, I'll answer the other ones in a little bit. Is it recommended to deep clone external tables to manage tables given more features of it? So great question. I'm going to hold that one because we're going to talk about that in a minute. So hopping back a little bit, I want to kind of frame where we were coming from, right? So this is the roadmap. We talked about the roadmap. The architecture here is important to recognize. Unity Catalog is a hub of like the Metastore, which is just a layer where logical like data gets saved, the Lineage Explorer, Data Explorer, permission model, Delta sharing, all the external locations and storage credentials, all your auditing, right? UC is intended to be that central hub for all those different resources, right? When we think about step one, we have to set up the identity federation, right? So that used to have to be done at workspace level. It was extremely frustrating, right? Now you can actually do this at the account level so that users and groups can be reused in different workspaces. You can still say like, hey, only this group is allowed to access these specific workspaces, right? But now you have this globally federated set of AD users and groups that now can be consumed by any workspace by the admins that you want to configure there. So that is so much simpler, right, than any other life cycle that we've been seeing folks having to deal with here. So highly recommend doing that transition, right? The account console, right, if you are an admin, is where you manage those different life cycles. You can see like the user management there. You can set different users to be account admins or workspace admins, right? And then those groups can be configured from a global Azure AD administrator, right, to set that up the first time, and that permission can be delegated to Databricks admins, right? There is a similar path. Your Databricks admin inside of like AWS or GCP is that global administrator that can then delegate those permissions to different account users, right? So no worries about any of that for like, does this work in Azure the same way as it works in AWS and GCP? It's a little bit different, right? But the core theme is like, on Azure, global AD admin needs to be the first person to go into it. Otherwise, the account console on AWS and GCP, the Databricks admin goes into the first time. And then can be delegated from there. Now, when we're actually setting up like the places where the data gets stored by default, right? You see, that's where the Metastore is. Like, you don't need that Hive Metastore anymore. Again, it doesn't delete the Hive Metastore that's in each workspace or anything like that. You both coexist, right? As I mentioned earlier, these are together in this strategy, and eventually you move more and more to the UC environment, right? When we are saying like, hey, if we are trying to manage all of these like how do I say, like entities over this, right? With Unity Catalog, it's a Unity Catalog metadata in the Metastore that has an associated storage account or S3 bucket or Google Cloud Storage location that centers around, right? And you can see like the difference in how the root buckets work, right? Like the default managed table data, right? Now, when you're actually trying to like create a Metastore, this is what it looks like. So you're saying like, hey, I've got this catalog, I've got a backed by a storage location, and you'll see how to set that up in a minute. And then those storage locations are actually referenced for specific kind of configurations here, and can be reused for other endpoints. But this is like generally for that main Metastore location to get you started. You could have a lot more storage locations that are used by other resources later, and other like workflows or work streams or teams, every team's got their own like kind of storage pattern, This path is a like path in your S3 or data lake root bucket, right? So it's like a path in that actual storage account where all of your default Metastore data goes. So you generally bunch of teams share that one managed metastore, and then they make their own external locations that are then consumed by their own teams such that billing can be segmented. And you can even have those external managed locations such that you get the benefits of managed locations. So as the anonymous attendee brought up, the difference between managed and external is pretty straightforward, but there are some performance benefits that come from managed, and that Databricks will auto-tune the performance on these clusters, the performance on these tables if they are managed. But obviously that generally means it is part of that managed thing, and it's a little bit harder to like pull that data out, right? It's still in your account, you can still like access it and move it, right? But it's all tied into this kind of ecosystem here, whereas the external tables can be from any blob or data lake or S3, sort of path, right? And all of those can be consumed and part of any sort of format based on what you're comfortable with, and like segmented across different lines of business. But again, managed tables can do that too with a managed external location. And I apologize for the confusing nomenclature, right? It's just the way that you see some of this messaging labeled. So when we talk about these external locations, right? These external locations are actually used to map any of those S3 ADLS configurations and connections here, right? So UC becomes the access control governor across all of these different paths on a data lake, right? And then now you see, like prior to Unity Catalog, it was just like clusters directly had permissions and exchanged them to cloud storage. Now Unity Catalog sits and grants like specific short-lived tokens to clusters and checks like, hey, does this person have access to this thing, right? And then that token is passed through, and then the cluster speaks with the resource directly, right? So it is extremely straightforward in how that permission model works. It doesn't slow it down, it just gets that token right at the first step in the process, right? And then it is consumed as part of that life cycle by the cluster. And then you see, like historically with Hive, those Hive controls can still work if you want to set them up that way. It doesn't break any of your pre-existing Hive workflows. That's a core and important thing I want to call out here. And then you see some of the external location patterns, right? There's some simple workflows, right? Where it's just like, hey, mapping different prod or dev or raw paths. Sometimes you see like teams use prod credentials for specifically the metastore route and the prod external locations, non-prod credentials separately. And then as necessary, you can make you can also have like a path like, hey, we can do as necessary storage credentials that are used for specific containers and such. Now, when you're thinking about like building a permission model here with production data, right, we can say, hey, let's grant these users that came in from AD, use catalog, schema, and select on these production data sets so that they can consume them, and all that's backed by those by that external location, right? So they have very fine-grained controls over the UC entities that are like owning this lifecycle. And obviously machines and entities would be running this specific lifecycle, right, of creating that data. And if you have non-production data, maybe those folks are allowed to use and create and modify and create external tables in these less governed sort of spaces, right? And make it a little bit more seamless, right, for folks to be able to modify things that exist in non-prod, because obviously we want good guardrails around prod data, and they don't have to be as strict, and you can be more dynamic building in a non-production environment. And when we talk about catalogs, see a lot of folks build dev, test, and prod catalog to get started, kind of mapping to their pre-existing workspaces. But long-term, I'd even recommend considering like using a domain-based catalog, right? Hey, we have different data domains that are used and consumed by different teams, right? That is pretty clearly what I would say is the best practice, because that can lead to like data mesh architectures. But I'm all about like a crawl, walk, run sort of story here, right? We want to make sure that we are iterating towards an ideal data estate end goal rather than trying to make the ultimate perfect thing and then never building it, right? I have a couple more slides and then I'll come back to your questions. So make sure to get them in the next minute or two. A couple more slides I'm specifically referencing before we get into like the Hive specific migration patterns, right? You can see some of the namespace workflows and how we're building towards this strategy where we have foreign catalogs, Hive Metastores there, and then additionally, right, like having models and functions governed in that same way too, and volumes, right? And you see the three-level namespace, right? The catalog conception maps to the Hive Metastore top level, and then the databases and tables or schemas and tables fit at those two lower levels. So migrating to Hive from like a logical structure isn't that hard. It's just a little, the Hive Metastore is the top level for the Hive Metastore catalog, right? That is segmented and only workspace bound versus the Unity catalogs that are across multiple workspaces, or can be if you want to govern them that way. So we'll talk about this slide in a minute. I want to make sure I answer your questions. Anonymous attendee at 119, I think I answered your question on a comprehensive list of what's offered for managed versus external. It's really down to like a performance enhancement workflow and then like the fully managed lifecycle there where you're going to get better performance benefits. I can guarantee that the liquid clustering workflows that were announced at Data and AI Summit will be first enabled on managed tables, right? So end of the day, those life cycles for managed are going to get more and more differentiated over time. But that's not to say you shouldn't use external if that's what your business is calling for, right? I would say like early on, you want to be thinking about how can I take what I have and bring that data into Unity in like the most seamless way for your business. A lot of the time that is external locations. Shankar, is there a plan to deprecate Hive Metastore? No, as far as I'm aware. For data, Shankar, for data governance, we use Azure Purview and Scan Databricks Hive Metastore to pull in metadata into Purview. Will the Unity catalog be supported with Purview? Yes. You can ask your Microsoft account team to get you added to the UC preview. I don't know if it's private or public. I think it's private preview, but that is definitely something that that is in the cards for us to build and eventually launch together. Jung, yes, you may have today's slides. Once we migrate everything to UC, can we decommission the MySQL RDS instance, which is used? Great question. The answer, to my understanding, is yes. Because I actually had a customer come to me with this a few months ago, like, I need to make sure we don't use that call out to the RDS instance. And on Azure, I believe it's like a MySQL instance that runs that. I've seen clusters work just fine, Unity only, with I think it's like DBR 11.3 and up. Don't quote me to that. That just block traffic to where that RDS instance was, and just Hive stuff doesn't work anymore. But yes, I believe you can. I would definitely test that. Ask your Databricks account team, but pretty sure that all works. Isaac, now we have global groups. Is there a way to handle legacy workspace groups that still have fairly dedicated permission structures? They still exist. They're not going to be like removed. I would say slowly transition them to a environment where they do exist in a way. How do I say this? Slowly transition them to be part of an account structure, right? But those will continue to exist. And you'll be able to modify them and add users to them, that sort of thing. It's just by default moving forward, account level permissions will be like what we would recommend, building from there on, and then slowly bringing more and more teams online with them. You guys are asking the best questions. Seeing groups that migrate to the account console will also become account level groups in non-UC workspaces. Is this account level groups? You should be able to segment users to only the workspaces that they should be delegated to. There should be no association to them if there is not a Metastore. That's interesting. Feel free to email me after the fact. I'm just gonna make sure to everyone has this email. Email me that question after the fact, and we can dig in a little bit further on that. All right, I'm not responding fast enough to get to all your questions. I think I'm going to answer a few more, then I'm going to hop on over, spend the last like 15 or 10 minutes talking about the Hive transition steps, which are super important, something we want to get to today. And then I'll save the last 10 minutes to finish up all the Q&A. So I'll go till 1:40 on the Q&A as far as I can get to, and we'll come back to it at 1:50. What kind of permission should instance profile have for external table if we want to control access via Unity catalog? That should be like basically a read-write sort of admin. The instance profile itself, I'm historically an Azure person more than I am an AWS one. So instance profiles are a little bit like not my forte, but we can get you those resources. There's some documentation around that, so that shouldn't be too hard to get. Yeah, cluster instance profile. That's going to change some because it's the permissions on the cluster instance profile would not be the same, right? It's going to be good, like remove there and then manage through Unity catalog instead. Purushottam, once we move to UC catalog, we need to use the 3-level namespace. On workspace level with Hive Metastore, we only use 2-level database. Okay, so the default, Purushottam, you ask again, team's asking great questions. I want to show you this amazing little flag here. This flag, spark.databricks.sql.initial catalog name, is how the migration happens in a way that is sustainable with the workflows that you already have. When you enable UC the first time, the initial catalog name on every cluster is set to Hive Metastore. That's how it doesn't break anything, right? Because it's using as the top level catalog Hive Metastore, right? So what's happening, the idea is that you start with the clusters using this initial catalog name as part one, right? Like how you start with, and then eventually you have the initial catalog shift to the data representations in UC on a UC catalog, right? So that's why all the 2-level namespace sort of workflows that you've already built are completely compatible with UC, right? You're just basically changing the catalog you're pointing at from Hive to UC. You don't have to make any code changes with those table-based workflows. Hope that helps. Is there a way to reverse the upgrade of a table from Hive to UC? Nothing that we do, either the sync command or deep clone deletes the data that's in Hive. That's an additional step you would take. So the reversal is more so like okay, we're going to use the Hive table again. Can managed Unity table schema specify a schema on the storage account? On slide 30, create managed table did not have a location clause. Yes, create managed table does not have a location clause. It is a configuration that you put on a schema or a catalog, right? To say like, hey, we want using the managed location using external location. So that's where it probably there's a little bit of confusion. I can find the exact doc and make sure that that's included in the outcomes here. Okay, I'm going to pause there. We're 2 minutes over already. And hop on back to this journey. So this is something that, like, if you talked to us 6 months ago, this strategy was not as clearly defined as it is here. And every good solution has 7 steps. So we wanted to make sure it was structured exactly the same as the other. roadmap to Unity Catalog is specifically a subset of that. Once we're in that journey on migrating to Unity Catalog, how do we migrate Hive to Unity Catalog? First, you need to understand your estate, right? Your data estate here becomes essential. And you need to understand, like, what's the breakdown of managed versus external tables? How often are you using DBFS mounts? How often are you using DBFS mount points versus like the root bucket? All of that becomes important. When we think about a sync step, this is for external tables. So when external tables are maybe DBFS mount path based, right? Those need to be translated to an ABFSS or GCS or an S3 path, right? Those connections become essential to these path structures. And making sure that we create a new external location as this is being defined, or if it doesn't already exist, is something you'll see as part of the script that one of the scripts I've made. Then once you have your data that is external synced, right, that means that the schemas are synced and they're pointing to the same location, right? Then you do a deep clone on managed tables. You say, okay, all these managed tables need to be moved out of the Hive Metastore because they're like encapsulated here. They need to be in the Unity catalog. So those go into whatever catalogs that you want to put them in, which are backed by whatever storage location that you want to save them to. And this is a point in time sync, right? So you want to make sure that you keep running deep clone on any tables that are still being updated. Then you migrate views, and which is a recursive activity, right? Because you might have views upon views upon views upon views, right? And you just have to gracefully handle failures, right? And then rerun on these subset of views that did not successfully work because they have those webs of dependencies, right? Then you upgrade, and this might seem a little bit weird, right? You upgrade the DBRs for pre-existing jobs. We're not changing anything to point at Unity yet, right? We just say all these existing jobs, they need to make sure that they work on a Unity catalog capable runtime, right? So if you're running on 7.3, that's not going to work anymore. You're going to have to shift to, I believe, 11.3 or 11.4, forget what it was, or higher, such that you get that Unity catalog functionality, but you don't want to enable Unity catalog for those jobs yet. This is just to make sure the 7.3 or whatever to 11.3 or higher transition works properly. Disassociate the failures from the migration up DBRs from the UC enablement, right? Then we're going to migrate the grants that exist on the Hive Metastore to permissions that exist on Unity, right? This is the hardest part if you were to try to do this from scratch, but there's an extremely helpful script that will do this. And then the Spark Databricks SQL initial catalog name is then set on each of those pre-existing jobs, such that they'll be pointing at all of the new tables that you've created in your Unity catalog workflows. So this ends up being super important. And kind of the final step, right? Because once that's enabled, then everything, all of your workflows that you've enabled this setting on are running on UC. So you want to make sure you understand the current state of the estate. The table breakdown, super important. You don't want to be so fast with managed tables because there is, this is going to, if you have a big data estate, that's going to take some time to do a deep clone, right? Be along for the ride and then filter out on tables that you just need to keep getting updated to like have as part of a recurring process. Then external tables, you want to audit like what's in DBFS, what's in a mount point, what's in an S3 or ABFS path. Then there are tools like the Hive Metastore lineage that will help with this, along with scripts that will actually, you'll see today, that actually can help you mine this information and then act on it. Step 2, this is, and again, I'm showing you somewhat simple examples, and you'll get these as code, so don't feel like you have to like screenshot it. This is basically doing a, if it is, and I show you a simple example so you can see kind of the workflow here. You can add your own business nuance or select certain tables. This is like the core of the process, right? For across all of your schemas, run a sync schema from the Hive Metastore to the Unity catalog sync, right? So all of those tables that are external will now be mapped in Unity catalog. And then if something fails, right, just get the sync results. And there will be things that fail because this is the naive solution. This is the solution that only considers things that already use S3 or ABFSS paths, right, which isn't probably a lot for you to get started. That's why we build this translate mounts function, which actually takes the listing of all the Hive mounts and then splits it up to look that up and say like, hey, translate if this mount is coming from here, replace it with an S3A path or an ABFSS path. Then this is a little much. I apologize for the code being a little bit small, but you will get these artifacts. You'll see this is actually implementing the translate mount point function with the kind of naive solution here, such that if any of these tables are external, it will create them, right, based on external locations. And if the external locations don't exist, it will create those too. Does that make sense? So you see how there's this, make sure that you have all of your external locations copied with all of your tables that are external, and then capture any failures. Manage table deep clone is another, this is a little bit more trivial than the sync table example. It's just like, hey, if this is managed, copy it, right? See on line 20, there is that deep clone of Hive Metastore to the UC table. Now, migrate views, it's a very similar process to like the naive solution from step 2, but it's just applied redundantly for any failures. And that's why that graceful failure handling is so important, right? Basically change the condition and say like, hey, if it's a view, then try to run it. If it fails, bucket it into like the failures and then rerun the failures after the first loop is done. Then when we're upgrading the DBR, right, I talked about this, I got on my soapbox a little bit earlier here, but we want to disassociate why jobs would fail from a DBR lifecycle update versus something that actually broke with a UC change, right? We want to make sure we upgrade all the jobs to be 11.3 or higher and test before integrating with UC. When we migrate grants, this is where I'm going to take you a little bit out of this, and we need to use a group permission migrator. And you can see this actually takes, this is a much bigger sort of life cycle project, right? Where it's basically like, hey, we have a table that is created that is like a mapping of all the permissions that exist against all of these different resources, right? For jobs, pipelines, that sort of thing. And then those grants are copied over into this big table, and then they are set, right, across all of these different examples, right? Such that all of those permissions are applied in that UC-based way for all of the output artifacts, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just want you to get a little feel for it. And again, you're going to get the slide decks. You'll see where this is all coming from. You'll be able to use this. And finally, I know we're a little bit over the time that I wanted, the boundary I set, but we already talked about this, but setting that default catalog becomes extremely important because that's how you take all of those 2-level namespaces and make them compatible with a UC pattern. You just shift from Hive Metastore being the default on a cluster to the catalog you're using being the default on a cluster, and all of your table-based workflows remain the same, just pointing at UC data. So you slice out workflows here, right? That's the big thing I want you to remember, right? You want to make sure, let me see if I go back to the high-level life cycle here. High-level life cycle. As we migrate those old workloads, right, we don't want to necessarily do boil the ocean. We want to do this on the workflows that make the most sense to have really robust lineage, have good governance, that sort of stuff, sensitive data especially, right? Those are the first things you target. The biggest workloads with the most important governance controls that you would need. I hope this was helpful. We're going to dive into Q&A. I'm going to try to answer all of your remaining questions. Feel free to keep asking them or email them after me. Email them to me after. What are our options around UC disaster recovery? How do we sync the UC objects from primary region to secondary region? Generally, that is a cloud provider discussion side. That is a great question. What I typically see, and one of the common patterns that I enable with customers, is basically taking a geo-redundant read access storage account, for example, right? Similar abstraction in AWS, such that there's always a read capacity to that second endpoint, right? And have the same data represented in two different Databricks regions, right? And have the same like definitions and pipelines run there, such that if anything breaks, you'll be able to pick that up, right? And run from the other workspace based on your SLA, right? And this is really a discussion around SLA because obviously there's cost associated with that. You want to be very deliberate about those changes, right? Shankar, thank you. Thanks for being here. Anonymous attendee, when will ML runtimes, R, Scala, etc. be supported by shared access mode UC enabled clusters? I know we got like UDF the other day on shared clusters, but I always challenge, and I used to work for Microsoft. I helped out a lot on like Azure ML, that sort of thing. What I thought was brilliant about how Azure ML worked, and not a lot there was like, it was not a lot there that I think was necessarily brilliant, but I loved the idea of me running a test on a compute instance in Azure ML, right? Where I'm working on a project individually, as most data scientists do, on single user clusters, right? I think single user clusters should be the data science paradigm. I'm injecting a lot of my own opinion there, right? Obviously, the shared model is important to a lot of like pre-existing workflows and a lot of our customers, but for data science specifically, a lot of that experimentation and environment configuration and that life cycle should be scoped in a single user zone. So as much as I'm not trying to like filibuster or anything we absolutely should have that capability in shared clusters. But I do reject that maybe is the best practice. And I do think that maybe shared is a little bit less of the ideal sort of solution, and it might be a little bit better targeted to use, especially like environment management for data science pipelines. It's a better target to use single user clusters. And of course, you're going to be using like a single user cluster for like any job, right? So that's less of an issue there. So great question. Brings up a lot of dialogue every will clusters still need to have an instance profile as if UC is managing credentials? No. We have a global group with the same name as a working workspace group, and it's causing confusion. Sounds like doing it manually is the only path forward. Thanks. Follow-up, is there a way to restrict visibility to a group when users are assigning permissions? I can contact. It's not off topic. This is all like SCIM and permissioning and governance. I don't think I'll have a perfect answer for this because I'm still trying to visualize. I see like the global and the specific workspace level groups, and we're trying to maybe restrict visibility on groups so people don't see that confusion, right? Those should be, you could definitely like on the account level remove groups from different workspaces, such that it would not be visible, but I don't know if that's desired behavior. Definitely something, feel free to email me, follow up on. Great question, Isaac. How can we make BI workloads be seamless, especially for two level? They also use the, like when you're using Databricks SQL, for example, which is referencing these endpoints, they have that same Spark SQL initial catalog name. So it will be two-level namespace in much the same way because it will default to that catalog. I actually had a customer come at me with Informatica workflow that they were running on Databricks, and Informatica was having some problems because they were using an older cluster. But when then they upgraded their Informatica version, they were able to do like a two-level namespace based workflow that is pointing to a UC data set or UC catalog, right? So that workflow is actually something that we can see a lot of work streams there, and basically ensures maximum compatibility. You know, how would you handle a scenario where non-prod workspaces are in one region and prod workspaces are in another? That's fine. You just use the Terraform exporter to export different permissions and states from one environment to another. The users and groups are global. Is there a way to block the applications to use managed tables and force them to use the external tables while having location pointed to a cloud storage? Yes, you can just allow people to save from specific catalogs and make all catalogs that they're allowed to save to point to specific external locations. Absolutely. Andrew, can the initial catalog be set at the workspace level? It's actually, that's a great question. I think it is. I think it can be. I've never tried. Feel free to follow up on that. That's a great question. Not that all of them aren't great, but I was like, got me there. Any tool to migrate existing Terraform states to UC resource states, examples, groups, and permissions. That's not as hard as you'd think, Tabib. I think the way that I would manage that is I would shift my view of like groups to be created at the Databricks Terraform provider for the account level and used effectively the same script for groups. And then permissions would be delegated in the same way just for these newly named groups at like workspace levels, if that makes sense. It looks like the new migration method is actually just creating a new table when we lose table history. Is there any way to maintain table history when doing this migration? The sync command maintains table history. The manage table, I mean, like how much history are we talking about, right? Like there's only so much that you would save with Delta specifically. I think the best way to do that would be, and that's all like a function of the Delta transaction log. I'd have to follow up on that. That's a good question. I know I've come across that once or twice. I forget the answer that we all came around to. So definitely can help out with that. Include that in your list. Regarding data lineage, the files tables from external sources be stitched to Databricks objects. I would assume that someone would eventually figure out that that's an important problem and we would address that. But I do not know if that is in any sort of pipeline to implement right now. So stay tuned for that. Anonymous attendee, each Hive Metastore database table needs to have an external location, or we can create external location at the database level. So each Unity catalog location can have an external location. It can also be defaulted to be part of the main metastore. It can also be like only external tables that are saved as part of this catalog, right? So you have options for Unity where you want to save catalog information by default. Since we'd be upgrading to UC officially at the end of this roadmap, how would it affect workflows currently? So upgrading to UC is a journey. Once you've done 1, 2, and 3 on this slide, right? and then you have done 4, 5, and 6 for at least one workflow, right? It could be like any table lifecycle, right? You've migrated that workflow to UC. It's less migrating overall to UC. It's more like, what workflows have I enabled for UC? Does that make sense? It's not going to affect any of the workflows currently going on, because all those get set. The default catalog is Hive Metastore, and they're going to continue to exist in that lifecycle. Doesn't break any of this. Does the migration script allow for external managed manage tables? Yeah, you could do that. The script that I was showing doesn't do that, but you could very easily just change it to say, like, okay, rather than do, like, if we take a look at number, where is it? I'm losing it, man. Yeah, if we take a look at number 2, right, you could just, instead of say stink schema, you could instead have a, like, deep clone, right? You could just deep clone from external to managed. If we have 2 UC catalogs, one for dev workspaces and one for prod workspaces, and we need to read prod data in a dev workspace, what sort of configuration is required? Okay. Depending on if you have networking controls, that's where that gets hard. If you have no networking controls and you're all running off identity layer, you can set it to be read access into the dev users and then in the dev workspace, they would be able to read that prod data, right? If you have networking boundaries between dev stage and prod, so on and so forth, you would need to establish like a private endpoint for the dev workspace to read the data that's on the storage account or S3 bucket that exists in that other, like, networking spoke. So it's a little bit more complicated if they're network segmented through networking. The identity layer remains the same, then you just add a private endpoint to talk to, or when I say private endpoint, I mean like a network path for that dev resource to scoop into the prod data and read it. But that's one of the cool superpowers of UC, and that it tears down a lot of those silos by default, and you can add those, like, segmentation on a networking level if that's necessary. Wow, answered all the questions. Any more questions before we drop? I hope y'all had fun. I hope this was valuable. Anything else before we call it a day?